The sun hung heavy in the wide Arizona sky, spreading gold and heat across the empty land. The road cut through dust and dry grass, and every sound carried far. A wagon rolled fast along that trail, the horse's hooves beating hard against the ground. Behind it, tied with thick rope, a young Apache woman stumbled and struggled to keep her balance. Her hands were bound, and the dirt clung to her face and clothes. Her name was Nalin. Her dark hair was tangled with dust, but her eyes stayed calm, proud, and alive. She did not cry or speak, even as her feet slipped in the dry earth. The men driving the wagon were rough riders, loud and careless. They laughed among themselves, boasting about how they caught her. They said she was part of a group that had been seen near the ridge. They had not cared to know her story. To them, she was only a prize, something to show or trade. The desert wind blew through their words, carrying the sound far ahead. Eli Warren was working on his ranch fence that afternoon. He was a quiet man, living alone on his land a few miles west of town. His life was simple: horses, fences, and silence. He had lost his wife 2 years before and had not spoken much since. The days passed the same way, marked only by the sun and the sound of the wind. But that day, as he hammered a loose board, something in the distance broke his quiet world. He heard shouting first, rough, angry voices, and the sound of wheels moving too fast. When he looked up, he saw the dust cloud coming down the trail. It wasn't a herd, it wasn't travelers. Then he saw the flash of movement behind the wagon, something that didn't fit the rhythm. His eyes narrowed. He dropped his hammer and walked to his horse. As the wagon came closer, Eli saw her, the woman being dragged. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then the truth hit him like heat in the chest. He mounted his horse and rode out fast, cutting across the field toward the road. The riders noticed him as he came near. A tall man with a weathered face, quiet but steady. They slowed a little when they saw he was armed, one hand resting near his revolver. Eli rode ahead and stopped his horse in the middle of the trail, blocking their path. Dust swirled around his boots. "Stop that wagon," he said, his voice calm but clear. The man holding the reins laughed and told him to move aside. Eli didn't move. His gray eyes stayed fixed on them. He spoke again, low and firm. "Cut her loose." The riders looked at one another, unsure for the first time. They knew of him, the rancher who lived alone and didn't fear anyone. But pride made them stubborn. One of them spat into the dirt and said it was none of his concern. Eli's voice dropped even lower. "You can turn that wagon around, or I can stop it myself." The men muttered to each other. The woman lifted her head just slightly. Her eyes met his. There was no fear there, only quiet strength. One of the riders cursed and reached for his gun. Before his hand even touched the handle, Eli moved. The sound of his revolver cracked once in the hot air. The man's hat flew off, the bullet grazing the brim, a warning shot that froze everyone. The horses reared. Dust rose thick around them. Eli dismounted, his steps slow and even. He walked past the frozen men, cut the ropes from Nalin's wrists, and caught her before she could fall. She was light, weaker than she looked, but still she tried to stand on her own. Her skin was sunburned and bruised from the rough road. Eli looked at her carefully, his voice gentle now. "You're safe here." She didn't answer, only looked at him with dark eyes that said more than words ever could. She whispered something in Apache, a soft sound like the wind through dry grass. He didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. The other men stood frozen, unsure what to do next. Eli turned to them. "You've done enough," he said. His tone was quiet, but there was iron in it. "Leave this land before I decide to take you into town myself." That was enough. The men gathered their reins and rode off, leaving the broken rope on the ground behind them. Eli lifted Nalin gently onto his horse and led it back toward his cabin. The ride was slow. She was too weak to hold herself steady. Her head rested lightly against his arm, her breath shallow. He kept his eyes ahead, his heart heavy with thoughts he couldn't name. The desert stretched wide around them, a silent world of sun and dust and distance. By the time they reached his small wooden cabin, the sky had turned orange. Eli carried her inside and set her near the fire. The cabin was simple, a table, 2 chairs, and the scent of pine wood. He brought a basin of water and began cleaning the dirt from her hands and face. She winced once but did not pull away. When he was done, she looked around the room quietly, her gaze moving over the walls, the fire, the shelf of worn books. Then her eyes returned to him. He offered her a piece of bread and a cup of water. She accepted both, holding them carefully as if afraid they might vanish. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with something unspoken. Respect, maybe, or something deeper neither could name. Outside, the night deepened. Coyotes cried far away. Eli sat by the window watching the stars rise. He thought of what he'd done, what it might cost. The men he faced would talk. They would come back angry. He knew how this land worked. People did not forgive easily, and they feared what they didn't understand. But he also knew what he saw in that woman's eyes. Strength, dignity, a quiet kind of courage that reminded him of the woman he once loved. When he looked back, Nalin had fallen asleep near the fire. Her face looked peaceful, even with the faint marks of rope on her skin. He took a blanket and laid it over her shoulders carefully, not wanting to wake her. For a long time he stood there watching the soft glow of the firelight touch her face. In that small, quiet cabin, something inside, Eli shifted. He had spent years trying not to care, trying not to feel anything that might hurt again, but saving her had woken something that had been asleep too long. The part of him that still believed in what was right, no matter the cost. Outside, the desert wind whispered around the cabin walls, carrying the scent of sage and dust. The horses in the corral stamped softly, uneasy under the moonlight. Eli sat down near the fire, his rifle resting by his side, his eyes fixed on the door. He knew that peace never lasted long in these parts. But for that night he promised himself one thing, that no harm would come to the woman sleeping under his roof. He didn't know her story yet. He didn't know what brought her near that ridge or who she was running from. All he knew was that she had survived something cruel, and that he could not turn away. The night grew deeper. The fire cracked softly, and the stars looked down through the open window. The rancher who had lived too long in silence finally closed his eyes and let sleep find him, his heart strangely lighter than it had been in years. The first light of dawn crept across the desert, soft and gold, brushing over the cabin walls and the sleeping woman by the fire. Eli woke before the sun fully rose, as he always did. The habit of early mornings had never left him. He stepped outside quietly, closing the door behind him so the sound would not wake her. The air was cool, calm, and filled with the faint smell of sage and earth. He walked toward the small corral where his horse waited. The world was still, but something in the silence felt different. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that happens before trouble comes. He looked out across the wide land and saw a faint dust cloud forming far on the ridge. It moved steady, too steady for the wind. He knew then they were coming back. The men from yesterday. He went back inside. Nalin was already awake. She sat near the fire, her eyes calm but sharp. When she saw his face, she seemed to understand without words. She rose slowly, her legs still weak but her posture straight and proud. Eli walked to the window, looked once more, and then turned to her. "They'll be here soon," he said quietly. She moved toward the table and picked up a small stick of charcoal from beside the stove. On the wooden surface, she began to draw. The lines were quick and certain. A ridge, a river, and several small shapes near the edge. Eli watched as she finished and pointed toward the hills behind the ranch. He realized what she meant. Her people were there. She had managed to send a signal last night somehow, maybe through a small fire or mark unseen by him. Her people had been close all along. He nodded and began to move with purpose. He checked his rifle, filled a canteen, and tied his horse at the side of the cabin where it would stay quiet. Nalin stood near the window, her eyes on the rising sun. She touched the edge of the table again, then pointed at the wagon trail. Her look told him she did not want him to stand alone. He gave her a faint smile. "Don't worry. I've stood alone before." By the time the riders reached the gate, the sky had turned from gold to pale blue. There were 10 of them, maybe more, their faces hard and angry. They shouted his name, telling him to come out. Eli stepped onto the porch, his voice steady. "You rode onto my land yesterday. You left your cruelty behind. Don't make the same mistake twice." The man at the front spat into the dust. "You took what's ours," he said. "Hand her over." Eli's jaw tightened. "She's not yours," he said simply. The men laughed, mocking him, but their laughter had no strength. The air around them was tense, and the quiet courage in Eli's eyes made them uncertain. The leader lifted his hand. "You think one man can stop us?" he shouted. Eli didn't answer. He looked past them toward the ridge. The wind had changed direction. The dust rose again, not from the men's horses, but from the far hills behind them. The riders didn't see it at first. Then one turned his head and froze. Small figures were appearing on the ridge, moving silently, swiftly, like shadows across the land. The Apache had come. The men shifted uneasily, their hands tightening on the reins. Nalin stepped out of the cabin then. She stood beside Eli, her head held high. The morning sun caught her dark hair and made it shine. The men stared, caught between anger and fear. Eli spoke again, his voice low but strong. "This land remembers what you do. Leave now, and you might still find peace today." One of them fired a shot into the air to scare him, but the sound only echoed once before a sharp whistle cut through the wind. An arrow struck the ground near their wagon wheel, quivering in the dirt. Another followed, splitting the wooden post beside the gate. The riders panicked, shouting to each other, turning their horses around in confusion. From the ridge, more Apache warriors appeared. Silent, quick, their eyes steady. They didn't attack, only watched. Their presence alone enough to drive the fear deeper into the men's hearts. The leader cursed under his breath and pulled on the reins. "Let's go," he growled. They turned their horses and rode hard the way they came, leaving dust and noise behind them. When they were gone, the world went quiet again. The sun climbed higher, warm and golden now. Nalin's people came down the slope carefully, their movements graceful and sure. Eli stepped back as they reached the cabin. The man in front, older, tall, with the same calm eyes as Nalin, stopped before him. There were no words exchanged at first, just silence and a look of understanding. Nalin spoke to him in her language, her voice soft but steady. The man nodded and placed his hand over his heart, then looked at Eli and did the same. Eli returned the gesture without fully knowing what it meant, but he could feel the respect in it. They prepared to leave soon after. Nalin's people helped her onto a horse, wrapping her in a woven shawl of deep red and tan. Before she mounted, she walked back to Eli. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She took his hand gently and held it for a moment. Then she placed her hand over his heart, the same way her brother had done. Her eyes glistened in the sunlight. Eli wanted to say something, maybe to tell her she'd be safe now, maybe to ask her name again just to hear it spoken. But the words stayed caught in his throat. She gave him a faint smile and turned away. He stood there as they rode off toward the ridge, the group moving in silence, their shadows stretching long behind them. When they vanished beyond the rocks, only the soft sound of the wind remained. Days passed. Life returned to its slow rhythm. Eli fixed the fences again, cared for his horses, and watched the skies for rain. But things were different now. The silence of his land no longer felt empty. At night, he often looked toward the ridge, remembering her quiet strength and the look in her eyes when she faced the men who had wronged her. He wondered if she remembered him too. Weeks later, one evening, as the sun sank low, Eli stood by the barn gate. The light painted everything gold and the shadows stretched across the valley. He was closing the gate when he noticed movement on the trail. A single rider was coming down slowly, the figure small against the fading sky. He waited as the rider came closer. It was Nalin. She wore the same shawl, her hair braided neatly, her face calm and strong. She dismounted near the gate and looked at him with the same quiet intensity. He didn't move for a long moment, unsure if this was a dream. Then he stepped forward. Neither spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath around them. The desert breeze moved softly between them, carrying the scent of dust and dry flowers. Nalin smiled faintly, her eyes warm. She took a small pouch from her side and handed it to him. Inside was a carved piece of wood, a small eagle, smooth and shining from care. She pointed to it, then to him, then to the sky. Eli understood it was a gift, a sign of friendship and remembrance. He closed his hand around it, feeling its weight. When he looked up again, she was still there, her eyes steady on his. For a long moment they stood in silence, two people from different worlds bound by one simple act of kindness and courage. Finally, she turned and walked back to her horse. Before mounting, she looked at him one last time and nodded. Then she rode away toward the ridge, the setting sun behind her turning the sky red and gold. Eli stayed there long after she was gone, the little wooden eagle warm in his palm. The desert was quiet again, but it was not the same silence anymore. It was filled with something new, something alive, something that felt like hope. That night, as the stars came out over the land, Eli sat by the fire in his cabin, holding the carving close. He thought of her courage, her eyes, and the way she had stood beside him without fear. For the first time in years, he smiled, and outside, somewhere beyond the ridge, a campfire burned faintly in the dark, a small light against the endless desert, like a promise that some things once found are never truly lost.